We've talked a little bit about the trending pop culture references. Let's talk about the sources. Where did this all come from? We need to go back very, very far. If we go further back, we're talking about the oral traditions that started getting put down on paper by Snorri Sturluson and other anonymous authors that we still don't know to this day on who to attribute these works to. So this is when we're going back to the prose Edda, and then we go to the poetic Eddas. Obviously we have our Norwegian sagas, our Icelandic sagas, our Danish sagas. Let's take a deep dive into the poetic Edda to begin with. The poetic Edda that was written by Snorri Sturluson, who was a scholar, linguist, and a law speaker in Iceland, has a wide range of topics that deals from the gods and the Jotuns to how they forged their alliances between the Aesir and Vanir, how the wars began between the Jotuns, the gods, and everything from Ymir and all the way down to the end of the world, Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. It covers things like the creations of magical swords, spears, hammers, and even wigs. It deals with Dvergar, dragons, and all kinds of heroes like Sigurd. So all the original manuscripts are digitized, and you can find them in many academic institutions from Iceland all the way to Denmark. Dozens of academic translations exist from the 20th century. Some of my favorites I have up on my bookshelf behind me. And I did my own translation, which is called the Illuminated Edda. Some poems are obviously incomplete. Some poems are contradictory to one another. And that was one of the challenges I had when I was doing my own translation. I ended up having to choose which stories I would be putting in the main body of work and which ones I would be putting in the appendix. And I was looking at a seamless transition between different stories that would have the most consistency in the Fate of the Norns universe. Now, if we end up looking at the prose Edda, that was written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, and it begins with a prologue that Snorri talks about the gods not really being gods. The gods are actually heroes from Troy that travel all the way to Scandinavia and become really renowned kings of almost mythical proportion. And the reason he does this is because if we think about it, in the 13th century, Iceland is already Christianized. And so Snorri is trying to basically have a nice little disclaimer here that will make sure that he does not get burned at the stake as a heretic. So after this prologue is done, he jumps right into the Gylfaginning, which we end up talking about everything from the creation of the world to the war of the gods, to the realms of gods, giants, elves, dwarves, dark elves, that could potentially be dwarves. This is some of the scholarly disputes that go on even to this day. And now we get to the Skaldskaparmal, which is the third chapter of the prose Edda. And this deals with kennings. These are poems that were written based on fleetings. So fleetings are verbal exchanges, almost challenges, like fighting words between different clans and families to try and get the best of others. It also deals with skaldic verse and how stories would be retold. And kennings had a very interesting way of talking about everyday items. So when you talked about a sword, you might call it a shield biter in your kennings. And so the kennings give us a much broader view of everything that was written in this time period in terms of how to interpret it. And then the Hatatal, which is the fourth chapter in the prose Edda, deals with Snorri's own poems, pretty much the rules governing kennings. So now that we've talked about Snorri's prose Edda, let's go into the second work, which is the Heimskringla, which is translated to be the Chronicle of Kings, and deals specifically with Norwegian kings, everyone from King Harald Fairhair all the way to Harald Hardrada in 1066. Other bodies of work, we're talking about Norse sagas, and these were written pretty much before the 9th century. Again, by anonymous writers, just like the Poetic Edda. This saga category includes over 36 manuscripts, and many of these sagas depict heroes and kings performing from very supernatural feats all the way to historic characters that are actually referenced in other documents, basically solidifying them to be less mythological and more historical in accuracy. We get to another piece of work that might give some of you shivers if you ended up having to read this in high school and this was forced upon you, which is Beowulf. So the Old English is not the easiest to slog through, and unless you're really a fan of the subject matter, some of these works can be a little bit of a drag and bring back a little bit of PTSD memories. And then we get to Saxo Grammaticus, another author that was credited with the writing of the Gesta Danorum. And this is the history of the Danes. This deals with 16 books that cover everything from supernatural effects all the way to succession of kings and battles. The history includes stories about gods, and there are various stories that actually bring a lot more completion to the stories that are found in the Eddas. For example, the stories of Balder, Hod, and Loki. It really illuminates things, and I think I'll save this for another video. Then we get to Icelandic sagas, and this is a body of work that was written between the 13th and 14th centuries. This deals with many families that are migrating because of King Harald Fairhair's war in Norway. They're migrating all the way over to Iceland, creating farmsteads, they're creating forms of government, and it's a very interesting period in the Viking Age. And even though it is much later in the Viking Age, a lot of these stories were written about events that happened generations before to the people that settled Iceland. And the really interesting thing is, to this very day, the gifting of books in Iceland is one of the best and most thoughtful gifts that can be given, because this is a culture that grew up on the codifying of their history, their ancestry, and the epic tales that surrounded these people. If you want to know more, maybe you'll cross paths with us at some of the conventions, because I do run a panel on this topic at most conventions I attend to. And if you have any questions, you can drop them into the comments section of the video below, or feel free to hit us up on social media. Until next time, skål.